Hi, I'm Geerges. As a whole, African Americans are actually worse off than they were 10 years ago. Lack of adequate health care, education, and economic opportunity. The state of Black America is not good.
As Black America goes, so goes the nation. You cannot have as significant a slice of the American populace as Black folk represent and think you can ignore their suffering. The point is, we have a race problem. And ultimately, in this campaign for the White House or some point in the future, we're going to have to ask ourselves, what kind of people are we really? What kind of nation do we really want to be?
Welcome to the Geerges Show. Years ago, Martin Luther King talked about two Americas. One, where people have food and material necessities for their bodies, culture and education for their minds, and freedom and dignity for their spirits. Then, there's the other one, without those things. In 2006, PBS host and author Tavis Smiley compiled a book, The Covenant with Black America. It was a plan to address the 10 most crucial issues facing African Americans. Now, 10 years later, African Americans have actually lost ground in all leading economic categories. And there's widening gaps between Black and white Americans in health, education, the justice system, and much more. Tavis Smiley joins me to talk about the Covenant 10 years later and the state of race in America. Tavis, welcome to the program.
Amy, good to be on. Thanks for the opportunity.
In 2008, we elected our first African American president. Everybody said, we're done. We're in a post-racial America. What happened?
Didn't quite work out that way. Racism is still the most intractable issue in this country, and that has a great deal to do with why these numbers are so much worse now than they were 10 years ago. To be clear, these issues existed prior to Barack Obama being elected president, but the 10-year gap, certainly since the first book and this new text, overlaps with his presidency. So it's hard to kind of dismiss the two. So the book was not about Barack Obama in 2006. It's not about him now. It's about how Black America can be made better by holding ourselves responsible and others accountable. But there are some real tough questions to ask about what has and has or has not happened for Black America over the course of the president's tenure.
Are you disappointed in Barack Obama's presidency?
I'm disappointed in every president, quite frankly. So I always think they can do more, and that's why presidents have to be held accountable.
But you would think that an African American president...
One would think. But I'm glad you said one would think, because I've said many times that great presidents aren't born, great presidents are made. They have to be pushed into their greatness. Put another way, there is no Abraham Lincoln if Frederick Douglass isn't pushing him. Lincoln started out on the wrong side of the slavery question, but Douglass pushed him. There is no FDR if A. Philip Randolph isn't pushing him, and there is no LBJ if MLK isn't pushing him. So left to their own devices, politicians end up being garden variety politicians rather than statesmen. They end up being transactional leaders rather than transformational leaders. And so Barack Obama has done a great deal. He's accomplished a lot up against a headwind, up against obstructionism. But had we pushed him in Black America and been less deferential, more would have gotten done.
So the hope and change really didn't work out for African Americans? Not
exactly. The irony of this, well, there are two ironies, maybe. One irony is that when you look at every poll, study, or survey, Black people have clearly, as the book details, caught the most hell over the last 10 years, and yet we remain the most optimistic, the most hopeful. It has something to do with our faith tradition and our belief in ourselves, our love for each other, our story in America, and frankly, our love of Barack Obama as president. So we're still a hopeful and optimistic people, but you can't juxtapose that so easily against the data. And what this book, The Covenant 10 years later, lays out is what the data tell us. What the data tell us, as you've already indicated, is that Black folk have lost ground in every major economic category over the last 10 years. Now the question is, how does the president's most loyal constituency end up losing more ground than anybody over the last 10 years?
Before we actually talk about some of those issues, and there are a lot in this book, I want to just put this out there because, as you know, there are lots of people in this country who do not consider themselves racist, who say, you know what, Black people do this to themselves. You should have stayed in school. You should have worked harder. You didn't have to go and sell drugs and end up in prison. So what do you say to that?
What I say to that is that is not the story of most Black Americans. I believe that every race of people, every race ought to be judged by the best they've been able to produce and not by the worst. So if you're going to judge America, Black America that is, by its worst, then that's the narrative you come away with. You judge Black America by its best. We have been the conscience of this country. We've been the group that taught America how to confront the redeeming of its own soul. We're the ones who kick down the doors, and everybody else, the women, the gays and lesbians, the animal rights activists, the environmentalists, we kicked down the doors and everybody else followed us in. So at our best, we represent what America really is all about. Again, but every community has storylines and narratives that one doesn't want to repeat or doesn't want to even confront. I was in Washington, New York the other day, and I was being interviewed on the Fox News channel, so you know how this conversation went, right? So me on Fox News. And they were trying to make this point that you're asking me about now, but they were doing it in a sort of punitive and pejorative sort of way where my people are concerned. They wanted to get into this conversation about the family, what if black people weren't having babies out of wedlock, yada, yada. You know the argument, you've heard it all before. And I said to them, you know what, here's the bottom line when it comes to the family. The nuclear family isn't what it used to be, and I understand so much of that, so much of what we are enduring comes from broken families. I get that. But the reality is that black folk don't get married, and white folk can't stay married. And because black folk don't get married and white folk can't stay married, we have a high divorce rate. We have a lot of babies born out of wedlock, and America has become, not just in black America, but America has become a single family, single parent society. But people want to take that data and just slap black folk upside the head with it. And with all due respect, President Obama played into that somewhat over his presidency by showing up at various times and lecturing black people. He did it at Morehouse at their graduation, lecturing black people. He did it in Chicago, at the church there in Chicago on the South Side. He lecturing apostolic, lecturing black people. He did it here in D.C. at the Congressional Black Caucus. Take off your house slippers and all that stuff. And I so preaching and talking down to black people is not a good way to motivate them.
Let me ask you about the very high-profile police killings.
Sure.
So we've had, Eric Gardner, Michael Brown, Laquan McDonald. Is it happening more, or are we just finding out about it more?
Clearly, social media has, given us such quick access to these stories when they break. I think that's a good thing. Social media at its best allows us to tell stories that otherwise wouldn't be told. There is no way that the case of Trayvon Martin would ever have come to light, much less been prosecuted, had black folk not pressed that on social media. I give them all the credit. And then Black Lives Matter and all the attention they've garnered for these issues. But here's the reality. Again, 10 years after the original covenant with Black America, black boys and black men are still being shot in the streets like dogs, and cops are getting away with that. 10 years later, black women are still dying from preventable diseases, and disproportionately at that. Black children can't get access to an equal high-quality education. Environmental racism still exists. The digital divide is persistent. So 10 years later, all these issues continue to get worse, but there's something about this issue you raise about the killing, the maiming of black lives. There's something this country still hasn't come to terms with, I think.
The first time it happened, I was like, wow, that cop overreacted. Right. The second time, it's like, wow, that cop's racist. The third time, it's like, what is going on?
And people want to look at these as individual incidents, and indeed they are. But here's the ultimate question. How many incidents equal a pattern? And that's the point you're making. This has become a pattern. And it's a pattern because there is not the respect for the sanctity and the dignity and the humanity of black life. And unless we ever get to that place, this will continue to happen if we don't take these issues more seriously.
African Americans are 44% of the prison population, but only 13% of the general population. Are African Americans more likely to commit crimes?
African Americans are more likely to be prosecuted for the crimes they get caught committing. And there are some of those persons who are sitting behind bars today, as we see these stories come out every so often, who are sitting behind bars and they're not even guilty. So thank God DNA evidence and other exculpatory evidence are starting to get the true story out about people who were behind bars for years, who were not guilty of the crimes they were alleged to have committed. So I don't know that African Americans are more prone to commit crimes. The reality is that white folk commit crimes against white people, and black folk commit crimes against black people. But there's a laser focus on the black community, and so black folk get caught committing crimes, and that's part of the reality. And the other part is that this narrative that existed, black people don't like cops or that we're anti-police, is nonsense. Because black people are victimized in the communities they live and work, if anybody wants to be protected and served by the cops, it's black folk. What we don't want is police misconduct. We don't want police abuse. We're not anti-police.
There was something interesting in the book. It said that the African American community feels like it has to make a choice between having a safe neighborhood with very aggressive policing and losing their civil rights and not being harassed by police.
Yep. In the book, we make a crucial distinction between community policing and policing the community. And some folk don't get it right. It's not policing the community, it's community policing, which means you do that in tandem with the community. So the good news in the book, and again, as I mentioned earlier, we've lost ground in every economic category, but there are also pockets of progress. I want to be clear about that. And one of those pockets of progress, because of all the attention focused on police departments, that there are a lot of departments now who are taking this issue more seriously, and they're starting to make moves and take steps that will start, I hope, to curb this kind of abuse, this kind of misconduct that we see cops do too often. Because here's the bottom line. When you live in a society where law enforcement is no longer trusted, not just by black folk, but by everybody, that's a real problem. Because eventually the end of that line is anarchy, and you don't want to live in a society where anarchy takes over, but you can't live in a society where people don't trust their cops. And that's precisely what's starting to happen. Look in Chicago. It's not even just that you couldn't trust the cops, you can't trust the mayor of Chicago. Rahm Emanuel ought to be gone quicker than right now and sooner than at once. He no longer deserves to be mayor of Chicago. And Barack Obama campaigned for him the first time. Barack Obama campaigned for him the second time. Barack Obama the other day said he still supports Rahm Emanuel. I love my president. I voted for him twice like everybody else. But we have to have a framework for how we critique our president even when we love him. We have to respect him, we have to protect him, and we got to correct him when he's wrong. Barack Obama standing behind Rahm Emanuel in Chicago when he was sitting on that tape for a whole year and knew what happened is unconscionable. And why it is that black folk in Chicago are calling for his ouster, but the president, it's just, you got to connect the dots on these issues. And again, it all comes back to holding people accountable. When you don't, this is what happens to black life.
Let's go back to the incarceration, because in the book there's an interesting quote. It says, "There is a multi-headed, multi-tentacled monster out there devouring blacks who live in certain neighborhoods. Incarceration is just one aspect of this menace, but it is an overwhelmingly damaging aspect." What is incarceration doing to these neighborhoods?
It's ripping families apart. It's ripping families apart. So for all those conservatives who want to ask about the disintegration of the African American family, look at mass incarceration. That's precisely what happens. And we know that we cannot incarcerate ourselves out of this. We are the most incarcerated nation, as you know, in the world. And again, one of those pockets of progress. There are signs, there are indicators that suggest that this is the one area of the 10 issues in this book, the one area where there might be some bipartisan consensus. I said the other day, talking to a friend of mine, that sometimes in our lives we do the right thing for the wrong reason. And this is one of those examples. So the Republicans in Congress are now talking to Democrats. Rand Paul and Cory Booker are hanging out because they think they can make some progress on meaningful criminal justice reform. But Cory Booker's motivations are not the same as the Republicans' motivations. Cory Booker is motivated by justice for black people. Republicans know that we can't spend our way out of this. We're wasting too much money on prisons. Too many tax dollars are going. They see it as a fiscal issue. We see it as a justice issue. I'm old enough now to say to you, I don't much care how we get there. If we arrive at the right place, I'll take it. But it's important to make that distinction.
This is mostly because of the whole war on drugs.
That's exactly right.
And the difference between crack
sentencing
and cocaine
That's
sentencing.
Right. And that sentencing number has gone down. Again, one of those pockets of progress. Over the last 10 years, that 100-to-1 powder to crack cocaine discrepancy has gone down to 18-to-1. You used to have to get caught with 100 times more powder than crack cocaine to get the same sentence. That was racist when they wrote the law. Now it's down to 18-to-1. It ought to be 1-to-1, but we're making progress, moving in the right direction. So again, over the last 10 years, pockets of progress, but broadly speaking, black people have lost ground in the major economic categories.
1 of every 3 black males born today can expect to go to prison in his lifetime. That's a really bad, those are really bad odds.
And I'm the first to say that the best way for black men to impact those numbers is to not be a criminal. Don't live a life of crime. I'm the first one to say that. We can't hold other people accountable if we're not first going to hold ourselves responsible. But it's a symbiotic relationship. It can't be either or, it's both and. And in our society, all we want to talk about is personal responsibility, but not government or corporate accountability. And so that's where this rub exists, because black people know that their government is dysfunctional. Black folk know that their lives tend not to matter. When you look at all these protests, and I want to give these young folk great credit for leading these protests in the streets over the last couple of years. When you look at their lives, the lives that they've been forced to live, it doesn't surprise me that this engine has started to rev up, that this has bubbled up to the top. It doesn't surprise me, because when you live a life where you are constantly marginalized politically, exploited economically, manipulated socially, something eventually has to give. And so I'm glad to see these young people are starting to wake up. Dr. King said all the time that a man can only ride your back when it's bent. Once you straighten your back up, you're going somewhere. And these young folk are straightening their backs, and I love to see it.
Are you in favor of the Black Lives Movement?
Absolutely.
What impact have they had?
A huge impact. Movements in this country are very rare, and I'm always leery, and I take your question, but I'm always leery of calling things movements, prematurely, because movements are very rare. The civil rights movement, the suffragist movement, movements are very rare in our society. But here's what does happen prior to a movement breaking out. It's what I call the 3 M's. You start with a moment. That moment builds momentum, and the momentum can become a movement. Moment, momentum, and movement. So we've had too many moments that caused the birth of the Black Lives Matter uprising. So we've had those moments. We clearly have momentum on our side in terms of having these issues addressed in the media and beyond. Whether or not it becomes a sustainable movement is another question. Occupy had a moment, and the momentum was built, but it never quite
didn't become a movement.
Precisely. So I'm leery of calling things movements, but we're definitely in that momentum phase.
Most people know that there's an achievement gap between black kids and white kids. But doesn't that have more to do with socioeconomic status? So it's really a gap between poor and rich.
There's an absolute link, and the book lays this out, a direct link, an inextricable link between poverty and miseducation, if I can put it that way. Poverty is threatening our very democracy. Poverty is now a matter of national security. What do you mean, Tavis? These numbers are not sustainable. 1% of the people cannot continue to own and control 40% of the wealth. The 400 richest Americans, 400 people, have wealth equivalent to the bottom 150 million of the rest of us. Those numbers are not sustainable. So again, it's a national security issue. It's threatening our very democracy. Dr. King said in his lifetime that if we didn't get serious about these three threats, the triple threat he called it, facing our democracy, racism, poverty, and militarism, we were going to lose our democracy. And so the link between poverty and education is so critical, because when somebody once said that if you're black without an education, you're twice defeated. Malcolm X put it this way: education is our passport to the future. The data in the book points out that education even isn't the great equalizer that it used to be. Because if you're black like I am, and you have a certain set of qualifications, and the white guy down the street has the same exact qualifications, who gets the job? The white guy does. So even education isn't the great equalizer. You can be overqualified as compared to the white guy. He still may get the job. So education isn't the great equalizer that it used to be, but without it, you are twice defeated. So we're gonna have to come back to figuring out how we address the poverty question. Because when you address the poverty question head on, and I believe that we can eradicate poverty in this country in 25 years if we wanted to. This is not a skill problem, this is a will problem. Do we have the will to eradicate poverty? If we do, we can do it in 25 years, and all those black children can gain access to an equal, high quality education.
But I was surprised to see that there is still a gap between wealthy black kids and wealthy white kids. Why?
Because racism is still the most intractable issue in this country, and it's not the great equalizer that it used to be. So America has a race problem. And ultimately, in this election or at some point in the future, because if you read the polls and read the research from Pew Research, for example, Americans are just as uncomfortable now and about race as they were when Obama got elected. That's the scary part. That everybody, to your earlier point, the way you started this conversation, we thought we were going into a post-racial era because we'd elected a black president. You look up 8 years later, and the country is just as depressed now and just as distressed now and as disturbed now about race relations as they were when the brother took office. How that is, I do not know. But the point is, we have a race problem. And ultimately, in this campaign for the White House or some point in the future, we're going to have to ask ourselves, what kind of people are we really? What kind of nation do we really want to be? And that's why this Trump thing is so disturbing, because it forces us to fundamentally ask, who are we really? What kind of nation? Not what we profess, but who are we really when we look in the mirror?
Why are you particularly distressed by Trump?
One, because he's rising in the polls. And two, because he's rising in the polls with media complicity. Donald Trump is being covered in this campaign, but he's not being challenged in this campaign by the media. They're covering him, but they're not condemning him. And that's sort of xenophobia.
But is that the role of the media?
Oh, absolutely.
To condemn him?
The role of the media, here's how you condemn him. The role of the media is to get at the truth. And when you get at the truth condemns. It's not me condemning. You put the truth, you put the facts on the table, and that's where the condemning part comes in. But when this New York-centric national media treats Donald Trump with hands off because that's just Donald being Donald, they're used to the bombast, they're used to the bluster, they're used to the bullying that he does, and so they don't take Donald Trump any more seriously now than they ever have in terms of checking him. But Donald Trump isn't. This ain't The Apprentice no more. It ain't even Celebrity Apprentice. This is the United States of America. This is a race for the White House. Right. And letting Donald do that just because that's Donald being Donald, that doesn't work. And so, and on top of that, let's be honest, you know the truth here, Mimi. The media, the mainstream media loves this. It's ratings.
Because
it's
people
money.
watch him.
Of course. It's ratings, it's money. You got a cat fight on the Republican side, a cat fight on the Democratic side. Who knew 2 months ago that the Republican nominee may be chosen before the Democratic nominee? We all thought Hillary had this thing on lockdown and the Republicans were going to fight it out. It could be that Trump gets it in a matter of days and Hillary and Bernie take it all the way to the finish line. So everything is, politics, as you know, changes so quickly. But the fact of the matter is that when people keep equating Donald Trump and say Bernie Sanders like they're both appealing to the margins, they miss the point. That's a false equivalency. Donald Trump is rising in the polls because he's appealing to the dark side, to the night side of America, and that's not what Bernie Sanders is doing.
In this election year, what do you want to hear the candidates say?
I want to hear the candidates address the issues in this book, the same issues that were on the docket 10 years ago that matter most to black people that we've been talking about in this conversation. Because as black America goes, so goes the nation. You cannot have as significant a slice of the American populace as black folk represent and think you can ignore their suffering. Their suffering can't be rendered invisible. So if we're not going to address the issues in this book, from health to education to the economy.
But why should we care? Besides that it's not fair, why should we care that there's a wealth gap, a health gap, an everything gap?
Great question. Because as black America goes, so goes the nation. I believe that when you make black America better, you make all of America better. We cannot afford to keep losing these minds, these hearts, these souls, these bodies at the rate that we are. Let's put it another way. America has lost its place as the leader, as number one, in so many categories now on the world stage. We're no longer number one in manufacturing, no longer number one in a number of these important categories. The question is, how do we get back, how do we regain our position as the leader in the world in everything if we're going to waste all this talent? That's a lot of black talent going to waste. That's a whole lot of brown talent going to waste. How does America become the great nation that she wants to be? Donald Trump's slogan is, make America great again. Well, how are you going to make America great again if you write off half the population because you won't educate them, you won't give them a job with a living wage?
Or they're all sitting in prison.
They're all sitting in prison. They're subject to environmental racism. How do you make America great again if you're going to write off half the population?
I'm curious. Obviously the Great Recession of 2008 hit everybody hard.
Yep.
But why haven't African Americans recovered like everybody else?
There are a number of answers. One is because the social safety net that once existed has been taken up. I love Bill Clinton. He's a personal friend of mine, and we've had these debates many times. He did a couple things that were horrific. He signed that crime bill that made that 100-to-1 thing stick. That put a lot of black folk behind bars for offenses now that Eric Holder said as Attorney General before he left, they're not even prosecuting anymore. They're not even doing that. Michelle Alexander's new book, the most recent book, The New Jim Crow, really makes the case for how mass incarceration is the new slavery, basically. So that we have to take these issues a lot more seriously about why these numbers are so bad. And when the social safety net gets lifted up because Bill Clinton advances a welfare reform bill that ended up being a welfare deform bill, we went after women with children on welfare. And we pushed this welfare to work program. I'm all for work, but the trade-off was they pulled up the social safety net. And the thing that's pushed more women and children into poverty in black America and beyond is that the social safety net was gone. So for the last 10 years, that number has really come to bear. So there are all kinds of prescriptions of what can be done. I will say this about this book very quickly. At the end of every one of these 10 covenant chapters, there are solutions. There are ideas for what every individual can do, what the government can do, what the private sector can do. This is not just a book condemning everybody, pointing fingers, casting aspersions. It's a book about where we are now and what really can be done to turn this around.
Tavis, give me one thing you want President Obama to do before he leaves office, something that he can do without Congress.
That's a good question because there's so many things he could do.
Just give me one of them.
I think he really needs to address head on. He could have done in the state union. He didn't address head on the crisis with police. These young people and this Black Lives Matter movement deserve more. They deserve some real leadership on this, not just lip service. And there are a number of things he could do by executive order to turn that situation a little bit.
Tavis, thanks so much for being on the program.
Mimi.
It's always nice to talk to you.
Pleasure's all mine, all the time.
And I hope we're not still here in 10 years talking about these same things.
We'll be here talking, I hope, but hopefully about a different subject. I'm with you. Yeah, thank you, Mimi.
This has been the Mimi Geerges Show. You can connect with us on social media and leave your comments there. Thanks for watching, and I hope you'll join me again next time.